Margaret Sullivan had always known her place in the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, Texas, even if she refused to accept it. At 19, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunset and eyes the color of storm clouds, she possessed a stubborn streak that her father, Thomas Sullivan, found both admirable and infuriating. The year was 1887, and women were expected to marry well, bear children, and keep silent about their dreams. Margaret had other plans. The Sullivan family had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years prior, fleeing the economic devastation that had swept through their hometown in Missouri. Thomas had managed to secure work as a clerk at the general store, while Margaret's mother, Elizabeth, took in washing and mending to make ends meet. They rented a small house on the outskirts of town, where the respectable families gave way to the working poor and the desperate. Margaret spent her days helping her mother with the laundry, but her evenings belonged to her books. She had managed to salvage a small collection during their hurried departure from Missouri, and she guarded them fiercely. While other young women her age gossiped about beaux and practiced their needlework, Margaret lost herself in stories of adventure and romance, dreaming of a life beyond the confines of Cedar Ridge. It was on a particularly sweltering Tuesday in July when Harold Pembroke first took notice of her. Margaret was hanging sheets on the line behind their house when she spotted him watching her from the road. Harold was 43 years old, a widower who owned a modest ranch on the other side of town. He had buried his wife 2 years prior and was considered quite the catch by the local mothers with unmarried daughters. He was also known for his quick temper and his belief that women needed a firm hand to keep them in line. Harold approached Thomas Sullivan that very evening, arriving at their front door with his hat in his hands and what he believed was a generous offer. Margaret listened from the kitchen as the two men discussed her future, as if she were a piece of livestock being negotiated over at market. "Your daughter is a fine-looking young woman, Thomas," Harold said, his voice carrying through the thin walls of their home. "I'm prepared to offer a substantial bride price for her hand, $500 cash money, plus I'll settle your debts at the general store." Margaret's blood ran cold. $500 was more money than her family had seen in years, and she knew her father was struggling to make their rent payments. She pressed her ear closer to the wall, straining to hear his response. "That's mighty generous of you, Harold," Thomas replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But I'd need to discuss this with Margaret. She's got her own mind about things." Harold's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Women don't need minds for marriage, Thomas. They need obedience. I've been watching your daughter, and I can see she's got some wild ideas, but I know how to handle spirited fillies. A few weeks under my roof and she'll settle down just fine." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. She had heard stories about Harold from the other women in town, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when unmarried girls came within earshot. His first wife had been seen with mysterious bruises, and more than one person had commented on how quickly her spirit had been broken after their wedding. When Harold finally left, Margaret confronted her father in the parlor. Thomas looked older than his 45 years. His shoulders stooped from worry and hard work. He couldn't meet her eyes when she entered the room. "You're not seriously considering his offer," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Thomas sighed heavily. "Margaret, you have to understand our situation. We're 3 months behind on rent, and Mrs. Patterson is threatening to evict us. Harold's offer would solve all our problems." "All your problems," Margaret corrected sharply. "What about mine? Father, you've heard the stories about Harold Pembroke. His first wife was miserable, and everyone knows it." "Those are just rumors, Margaret. Harold is a respected member of this community. He owns land, he has money, and he's offering you security. Most women would be grateful for such an opportunity." Margaret stared at her father in disbelief. "I won't marry him, Father. I won't be sold like cattle to pay your debts." Thomas's face hardened. "You'll do as you're told, young lady. I've already given Harold my word that we'll consider his proposal seriously. He's coming back tomorrow evening for an answer." That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities. She could run away, but where would she go with no money and no connections? She could refuse and hope her father would support her decision, but she knew the financial pressure would eventually wear him down. By morning, she had made her choice. When Harold returned the following evening, Margaret was waiting in the parlor with her parents. She had dressed carefully in her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days but still fit her well. Her hair was pinned back severely, and her expression was composed. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Pembroke," she said before her father could speak, "but I must respectfully decline. I have no intention of marrying at this time." Harold's face darkened immediately. "I beg your pardon." "I said no, Mr. Pembroke. I won't marry you." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold looked from Margaret to her father, his jaw working as if he were chewing on something distasteful. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly caught between his daughter's defiance and his desperation. "Thomas," Harold said slowly, "I believe your daughter needs a lesson in respect. In my day, children who spoke out of turn to their elders faced consequences." Margaret felt her mother's hand grip her arm in warning, but she refused to back down. "I've been perfectly respectful, Mr. Pembroke. I simply gave you my answer to your proposal." Harold stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Your answer is not the one I came here to receive. Thomas, I suggest you take your daughter in hand before she brings shame upon your family. A woman who can't be controlled by her father certainly won't be controlled by her husband." After Harold left, the house erupted in shouting. Thomas was furious with Margaret for embarrassing him, while Elizabeth tried to play peacemaker between her husband and daughter. Margaret held her ground, repeating that she would not marry Harold Pembroke under any circumstances. "You're being selfish, Margaret," Thomas shouted, his face red with anger and frustration. "You're willing to let your entire family become homeless because you think you're too good for an honest man's proposal." "Honest," Margaret shot back. "There's nothing honest about buying a wife like she's a prize heifer, and there's nothing honest about a man who beats his wife into submission." Thomas raised his hand as if to strike her, but Elizabeth stepped between them. "That's enough, both of you," she said firmly. "We'll discuss this calmly tomorrow when everyone has had time to think." But Harold Pembroke wasn't willing to wait for calm discussion. 3 days later, he returned with the town's mayor, Jonathan Whitley, and the local sheriff, Robert Hayes. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as the three men approached their front door, their expressions grim and determined. "Thomas Sullivan," Mayor Whitley announced when her father opened the door, "we're here on official business regarding your daughter's conduct." Margaret's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Harold had used his influence in the community to turn her refusal into something more sinister. She listened in growing horror as the mayor explained that Harold had filed a complaint about her unnatural defiance and unwomanly behavior that was setting a bad example for other young women in the community. "The town council has discussed this matter," Mayor Whitley continued, "and we've decided that your daughter needs to learn proper respect for her elders and betters. Harold has graciously agreed to withdraw his complaint if Margaret apologizes publicly and accepts his proposal of marriage." Thomas looked stricken. "And if she refuses?" Sheriff Hayes spoke for the first time. "Then she'll face the consequences for her defiant behavior. The town has standards, Thomas, and young women who think they can defy respectable men need to learn their place." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear coursing through her body. "I won't apologize for refusing an unwanted marriage proposal, and I certainly won't accept it under threat." Harold smiled coldly. "Then you've made your choice, Miss Sullivan. Sheriff Hayes, I believe you know what needs to be done." The sheriff looked uncomfortable but nodded. "Margaret Sullivan, by the authority vested in me by the town of Cedar Ridge, you're hereby ordered to submit to corrective discipline for your defiant and unnatural behavior toward a respected member of this community." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had heard of such punishments being administered to unruly servants or women accused of adultery, but she had never imagined she would face such a fate for simply refusing a marriage proposal. "This is madness," Elizabeth whispered, but Thomas remained silent, his face pale with shock and fear. "The punishment will be administered publicly tomorrow at noon in the town square," Sheriff Hayes announced. 10 lashes with a leather strap, to be followed by a public apology and acceptance of Mr. Pembroke's proposal. Margaret's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to remain standing. Around her, the world seemed to be spinning out of control, but she refused to give Harold the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She would face whatever came next with dignity, even if it killed her. As the men filed out of their home, Harold paused at the threshold. "This could all be avoided, Margaret," he said quietly. "Just say yes, and we can pretend none of this happened." Margaret looked him straight in the eye. "I'd rather face your strap than your marriage bed." Harold's smile was cruel. "Tomorrow you'll get both." The news of Margaret Sullivan's impending punishment spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. By evening, everyone in town knew that the Sullivan girl had defied Harold Pembroke's marriage proposal and would face public discipline for her unnatural behavior. The reactions were as varied as the people themselves. In the parlor of the mayor's house, the town's leading ladies gathered for their weekly quilting circle, though little sewing was accomplished that evening. Mrs. Whitley, the mayor's wife, held court from her position at the head of the quilting frame, her voice carrying the authority of her husband's position. "It's about time someone took that girl in hand," she declared, threading her needle with sharp, precise movements. "I've seen her walking around town with her nose in a book, acting like she's better than the rest of us. A woman needs to know her place, and Margaret Sullivan has forgotten hers." Mrs. Patricia Reynolds, the banker's wife, nodded emphatically. "My Henry saw her at the general store last week, arguing with Mr. Franklin about the price of flour. Arguing. Can you imagine? In my day, young women accepted what their betters told them without question." But not everyone in the circle agreed. Mrs. Catherine Foster, whose husband owned the town's only restaurant, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had always liked Margaret, finding her more interesting than most of the vapid young women who filled their days with gossip and fashion. "Don't you think this punishment is rather severe?" she ventured carefully. After all, she only refused a marriage proposal. Surely that's her right. The room fell silent. Mrs. Whitley's needle paused in mid-stitch as she fixed Catherine with a stern look. "Rights," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Young women have the right to obey their fathers and respect their elders. Margaret Sullivan has shown neither obedience nor respect, and now she must face the consequences." Meanwhile, in the town's saloon, the men were having their own discussions about the upcoming spectacle. Most of them supported Harold's actions, viewing Margaret's defiance as a dangerous precedent that could inspire their own wives and daughters to similar rebellion. "Harold's doing the right thing," declared Jim Patterson, the town's blacksmith. "Let one woman get away with talking back to a man's proposal, and before you know it, they'll all be thinking they can pick and choose their husbands like they're shopping for ribbons." Several of the other men raised their glasses in agreement, but one voice dissented from the back of the room. Jack Morrison, a rancher who lived on the outskirts of town, had been quietly nursing his whiskey while listening to the conversation. At 35, Jack was known for his fairness and his reluctance to join in the town's gossip and politics. "Seems to me a woman should have some say in who she marries," Jack said quietly, his voice cutting through the laughter and boisterous agreement. "Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, not a business transaction." The saloon fell silent. Harold, who had been holding court at the bar, turned to face Jack with a dangerous glint in his eyes. "That's mighty progressive thinking, Morrison. I suppose next you'll be telling us that women should vote and own property too." Jack met Harold's gaze steadily. "I'm just saying that forcing a woman into marriage through intimidation and violence doesn't seem much like courtship to me." Harold's face flushed red. "Nobody's forcing anything, Morrison. Margaret Sullivan brought this on herself with her defiant behavior. If she'd shown proper respect from the beginning, none of this would be necessary." "Proper respect," Jack repeated, setting down his glass with deliberate care. "You mean the kind of respect that comes from fear." The tension in the room was palpable. Harold took a step toward Jack, his hands clenched into fists. "You seem mighty concerned about another man's business, Morrison. Makes a man wonder if you've got designs on the girl yourself." Jack stood up slowly, his tall frame unfolding from the chair with fluid grace. At 6 feet 2 inches, he towered over most of the men in the room, including Harold. "I don't have designs on anyone," he said calmly. "I just don't like seeing innocent people bullied by those who think their money and connections put them above common decency." Sheriff Hayes quickly stepped between the two men before the confrontation could escalate further. "That's enough, both of you. Harold, the matter is settled for tomorrow. Jack, I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself unless you want to join Miss Sullivan in the town square." Jack looked at the sheriff with disgust but said nothing more. He threw some coins on the bar and walked out into the night, leaving behind a room full of men who were suddenly less comfortable with their earlier enthusiasm for Margaret's punishment. Back at the Sullivan house, the family sat in their small parlor, the weight of the coming day pressing down on them like a physical force. Elizabeth had been crying intermittently since the sheriff's visit, while Thomas stared into the fireplace as if the flames might offer some solution to their predicament. Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky, and trying to prepare herself mentally for what she would face. She had spent the evening writing letters, one to her aunt in California, explaining the situation and asking for help in finding work if she survived the punishment, and another to the local newspaper editor, detailing the corruption and abuse of power that had led to her current situation. "You could still change your mind," Elizabeth said quietly, breaking the long silence. "Harold might be willing to forget all this if you just apologized and accepted his proposal." Margaret turned from the window to face her mother. Elizabeth looked older than her 42 years, worn down by poverty and worry. Margaret felt a stab of guilt for the pain she was causing her family, but she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. "Mama, would you want me to marry a man who would do this to me just for saying no? What kind of marriage would that be?" Thomas finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It would be a marriage that keeps you alive and gives you security. Margaret, you don't understand what you're facing tomorrow. Harold isn't just going to give you a few gentle swats and send you home. He means to break you completely." "Then he'll be disappointed," Margaret replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "I won't let him break me, Papa. I won't let him win." Thomas stood up abruptly and began packing the small room. "This is all my fault," he muttered. "If I'd been a better provider, if I'd been able to keep us out of debt, none of this would have happened. Harold never would have dared approach us if we weren't desperate." Margaret rose and placed a hand on her father's arm. "This isn't about money, Papa. This is about power and control. Harold would have found another way to try to force me into marriage even if we were rich. Men like him can't stand the idea of a woman having her own will." That night none of the Sullivans slept well. Margaret lay awake listening to her parents' whispered conversation in the next room, punctuated by her mother's quiet sobs. She tried to imagine what the next day would bring, but her mind shied away from the details. Instead, she focused on the reasons she was willing to endure this punishment. She thought about the other young women in Cedar Ridge, girls like her who might find themselves in similar situations if she gave in to Harold's demands. She thought about the precedent her submission would set, and how it would embolden other men to use similar tactics against women who dared to assert their independence. Most of all, she thought about the kind of life she would have as Harold's wife. She had seen what happened to spirited women who married controlling men. They withered and died inside, becoming shadows of their former selves. She would rather face Harold's strap in public than spend the rest of her life facing his private cruelties behind closed doors. As dawn approached, Margaret finally fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with images of leather straps and jeering crowds. But even in her nightmares, she stood tall and defiant, refusing to bow to the man who thought he could buy her submission with fear and pain. Outside her window, The first light of what would prove to be a day that changed everything was beginning to creep across the horizon. In a few hours, the entire town would gather in the square to witness what they expected would be the breaking of Margaret Sullivan's spirit. What they would see instead would shake the very foundations of their small community and set in motion events that none of them could have predicted. The morning of Margaret's punishment dawned clear and hot, with the kind of merciless Texas sun that could bake the moisture from a person's body in a matter of hours. By 10 o'clock, the temperature was already climbing toward what promised to be a scorching afternoon, and the town square was beginning to fill with curious onlookers. Margaret had risen before dawn, spending her final hours of freedom in careful preparation. She bathed thoroughly, knowing it might be her last opportunity for some time, and dressed in her simplest white cotton dress, one that would show the blood if things went as badly as she feared they might. She braided her auburn hair into a simple plait down her back, securing it with a piece of blue ribbon that had been her grandmother's. Elizabeth had tried to force breakfast on her daughter, but Margaret's stomach was too knotted with anxiety to accept food. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table sipping weak coffee and watching her parents move around the house like ghosts, neither of them able to meet her eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. "I should have stood up to him," Thomas said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the house. "I should have told Harold Pembroke to go to hell when he first darkened our door." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her father's weathered hand. "You did what you thought was best for the family, Papa. I don't blame you for any of this." "But I blame myself," Thomas replied, his voice breaking. "What kind of father allows his daughter to face such a fate? What kind of man am I?" "You're a good man who found himself in an impossible situation," Margaret said firmly. "Harold Pembroke and his cronies are the ones who should be ashamed, not you." At 11:30, Sheriff Hayes arrived at their door, his expression grim and uncomfortable. Margaret could see that he took no pleasure in his task, but she also knew he wouldn't let personal feelings interfere with his duty. In Cedar Ridge, Sheriff Hayes had built his reputation on following orders and maintaining order, even when those orders came from corrupt sources. "It's time, Miss Sullivan," he said quietly, his hat in his hands. Margaret stood up slowly, smoothing down her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. She had made her peace with what was coming, but her body still responded to the fear with nervous energy that made her feel lightheaded and sick. Elizabeth rushed forward and enveloped her daughter in a fierce embrace. "I love you, Margaret," she whispered into her ear. "No matter what happens today, remember that your parents love you and are proud of your courage." Thomas joined them, wrapping his arms around both women. For a moment, the three of them stood together, drawing strength from each other in what might be their final moments as a complete family. Margaret knew that regardless of the outcome of her punishment, their relationships would be forever changed by the events of this day. The walk to the town square felt both endless and far too short. Margaret held her head high as she moved through the streets of Cedar Ridge, flanked by Sheriff Hayes and followed by her parents. Word had spread quickly that the procession was beginning, and people emerged from shops and houses to watch them pass. The reactions were mixed. Some of the onlookers called out encouragement to Harold's cause, shouting things like, "Teach her proper respect," and "About time someone took that girl down a peg." But others watched in uncomfortable silence, and Margaret caught sight of several women who looked away when she tried to make eye contact, as if they were ashamed to witness what was about to unfold. The town square had been transformed for the occasion. A wooden platform had been erected in the center, with a sturdy post driven deep into the ground. Leather restraints hung from the post at shoulder height, leaving no doubt about their intended purpose. A crowd of nearly 200 people had gathered around the platform, far more than typically attended even the most popular town events. Harold Pembroke stood near the platform, dressed in his finest clothes and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. Beside him stood Mayor Whitley and several other members of the town council, all of them looking appropriately solemn for the serious business at hand. Harold held a thick leather strap in his right hand, the kind used for disciplining horses and unruly servants. Margaret felt her courage waver for the first time as she saw the crowd and the preparations that had been made for her punishment. This wasn't going to be a private matter settled quickly and forgotten. This was a public spectacle designed to humiliate her as much as to cause her physical pain. Mayor Whitley stepped forward as Margaret and her escort approached the platform. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge," he announced in a carrying voice, "we are gathered here today to witness the correction of a young woman who has forgotten her place in our community. Margaret Sullivan has shown defiant and unnatural behavior toward a respected member of our town, and she must now face the consequences of her actions." Margaret climbed the steps to the platform on unsteady legs, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the crowd could hear it. The wooden boards felt solid beneath her feet, but everything else seemed to be spinning around her in a haze of fear and unreality. Sheriff Hayes approached her with the leather restraints. "Miss Sullivan, you need to place your hands against the post." Margaret looked out at the crowd, searching for friendly faces among the sea of eager, hostile, and curious expressions. She spotted Mrs. Foster from the restaurant, who was watching with obvious distress. Near the back of the crowd, she saw Jack Morrison, the rancher who had spoken up for her in the saloon the night before. His face was dark with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Miss Sullivan," Sheriff Hayes repeated, more gently this time. Margaret turned to face the post, placing her palms flat against the rough wood. The sheriff secured the leather restraints around her wrists, adjusting them so they were tight enough to hold her but not tight enough to cut off circulation. Margaret was grateful for his small kindness in the midst of the horror. Harold stepped forward, the leather strap in his hand gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "Margaret Sullivan," he said loudly, "you have been found guilty of defiant and unnatural behavior toward your betters. You are hereby sentenced to 10 lashes, after which you will publicly apologize for your conduct and accept my proposal of marriage. Do you have anything to say before your punishment begins?" Margaret turned her head to look at Harold over her shoulder. Despite everything that had brought her to this moment, despite the fear coursing through her body and the knowledge of the pain to come, she found her voice. "I have nothing to apologize for," she said clearly, her words carrying across the suddenly silent square. "I refused an unwanted marriage proposal, which is my right as a human being. If that makes me defiant and unnatural in your eyes, then I accept those labels proudly." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people seemed shocked by her continued defiance, while others appeared grudgingly impressed by her courage. Harold's face darkened with rage. "So be it," he said through gritted teeth. "Your punishment will proceed as ordered." Harold raised the leather strap above his head, the muscles in his arm tensing as he prepared to deliver the first blow. Margaret closed her eyes and braced herself against the post, trying to find some inner strength to carry her through what was coming. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the sharp crack of leather against flesh that would begin Margaret's ordeal. Children had been lifted onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view, and women craned their necks to see over the heads of the men in front of them. But just as Harold began to bring the strap down, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "Stop this madness." Every head turned to see Jack Morrison pushing his way through the packed square, his face set with determination and fury. People scrambled to get out of his way as he moved toward the platform with purposeful strides. Harold paused with the strap still raised above his head. "This is none of your concern, Morrison. Stand back." Jack didn't slow his approach. "This is every decent person's concern, Pembroke. What you're doing here isn't justice, it's barbarism." "The law has been followed," Mayor Whitley protested. "Miss Sullivan was given a fair hearing and found guilty of defiant behavior." Jack reached the platform and placed one booted foot on the bottom step. "What law?" he demanded. "Show me the statute that says a woman can be whipped for refusing a marriage proposal. Show me the court that tried and convicted her. This isn't law, this is a lynching in everything but name." Sheriff Hayes stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is official town business." "Official," Jack laughed bitterly. "Sheriff, You know as well as I do that there's nothing official about this. This is just Harold Pembroke using his money and influence to terrorize a young woman into submission because his pride was wounded. Margaret had turned to watch the confrontation, hope flickering in her chest for the first time since the ordeal began. Around the square, she could see people beginning to shift uncomfortably, as if Jack's words were making them see the situation in a new light. Harold's patience finally snapped. "Enough!" he roared. "Sheriff Hayes, arrest this man for interfering with justice. I'll deal with him after I've finished with the girl." But as Sheriff Hayes reached for his handcuffs, another voice joined Jack's protest. "The man's right," called out Dr. Samuel Wright, the town's physician. "This isn't justice, it's revenge. And I'll be damned if I'll stand by and watch a young woman be tortured because she had the courage to say no to a bully." Then Mrs. Foster stepped forward from the crowd. "I won't watch this either," she declared, her voice shaking but determined. "Margaret Sullivan is a good girl who doesn't deserve this treatment." One by one, other voices began to join the protest. Not everyone in the crowd spoke up. Many still supported Harold's actions, or were too frightened to oppose the town's power structure. But enough people found their courage to create a growing chorus of dissent that couldn't be ignored. Harold looked around the square with growing rage and desperation. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The crowd was supposed to cheer his authority and applaud Margaret's submission. Instead, his carefully orchestrated demonstration of power was falling apart before his eyes. Part 4. The confrontation in the town square had reached a boiling point. Harold Pembroke stood on the platform, his face purple with rage and the leather strap trembling in his raised hand. Below him, Jack Morrison had climbed halfway up the steps, his tall frame blocking Harold's path to Margaret. The crowd was no longer silent. Voices were being raised on both sides, and the carefully orchestrated punishment was degenerating into chaos. "Sheriff Hayes," Harold barked, "I gave you an order. Arrest this man immediately." Sheriff Hayes looked deeply uncomfortable as he surveyed the increasingly agitated crowd. What had started as a simple demonstration of authority was rapidly spiraling out of control, and he could see that forcing the issue might lead to violence. His job was to keep the peace, and right now, peace seemed to require a different approach than anyone had anticipated. "Mr. Morrison," the sheriff said carefully, "I need you to step back and let us proceed with the lawful punishment." Jack didn't move from his position on the steps. "There's nothing lawful about this, Sheriff, and you know it. Harold Pembroke has no legal authority to order a whipping, and you have no legal authority to carry out his personal vendetta." Dr. Wright pushed his way closer to the platform. "Sheriff, as the town's physician, I'm obligated to point out that this punishment could cause serious injury or even death. Miss Sullivan is a young woman, not a hardened criminal, and 10 lashes with that strap could permanently damage her. Harold turned on the doctor with fury. Stay out of this, right? The girl brought this on herself with her defiant behavior. Defiant behavior. Mrs. Foster had found her voice and wasn't backing down. She refused a marriage proposal. Since when is that a crime in Texas? Mayor Whitley attempted to regain control of the situation. Citizens, please maintain order. The town council has reviewed this matter thoroughly, and the punishment has been authorized under our community standards. What community standards? Demanded Catherine Morrison, Jack's sister, who had arrived with several other women from the respectable part of town. I've lived in Cedar Ridge for 15 years, and I've never heard of a woman being whipped for refusing to marry someone she doesn't want. Margaret remained bound to the post, watching the argument swirl around her with a mixture of hope and terror. She could see that the crowd was genuinely divided, but she also knew that Harold had too much invested in this demonstration to back down easily. The strap was still in his hand, and his humiliation at the public challenge to his authority was only making him more dangerous. Thomas Sullivan, who had been standing at the edge of the platform in helpless anguish, finally found his voice. "Harold," he said loudly, "I withdraw my consent to this marriage. Whatever debts I owe you, I'll find another way to pay them. Leave my daughter alone." Harold whirled on Thomas with venomous rage. "It's too late for that, Thomas. Your daughter's defiance is a threat to the natural order of this community. If she gets away with refusing a proper man's proposal, every woman in town will think she can do the same. This stops here and now." Jack took another step up the platform. "The only thing that stops here and now is this barbaric spectacle. Margaret Sullivan has done nothing wrong, and I won't let you touch her." "And just what do you think you can do to stop me?" Harold snarled, finally lowering the strap but keeping it ready. "You're outnumbered, Morrison. The law is on my side." Jack's smile was cold and dangerous. "The law, maybe, but not justice, and I don't think you have as much support as you believe." Indeed, the crowd had continued to shift during the confrontation. What had started as perhaps 60% support for Harold's actions had dwindled to maybe 40%, with many people looking increasingly uncomfortable with the proceedings. The sight of Margaret bound to the post, her white dress already damp with perspiration and fear, was affecting even some of Harold's supporters. One of the town council members, Benjamin Foster, Mrs. Foster's husband and the restaurant owner, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Harold, perhaps we should reconsider this course of action. The community seems divided on the matter." Harold's head snapped toward Foster. "Divided? Benjamin, you voted with the rest of the council to authorize this punishment. Are you telling me you're changing your mind now?" Foster looked deeply uncomfortable but held his ground. "I voted to authorize discipline for truly defiant behavior, but I'm beginning to wonder if refusing a marriage proposal really constitutes the kind of defiance that warrants this level of punishment." "She's refused to apologize," Mayor Whitley pointed out, though his voice lacked conviction. "Even now, she shows no remorse for her actions." Margaret found her voice, calling out clearly across the square. "I refuse to apologize because I've done nothing wrong. Mr. Pembroke proposed marriage and I declined. That's not defiance. That's exercising the basic human right to choose my own husband." "Women don't have the right to choose," Harold shot back. "Women have the right to obey their fathers and their husbands. Everything else is just rebellious nonsense that leads to the breakdown of society." "Then maybe society needs to break down," Jack said quietly, but his words carried across the suddenly silent square. "Maybe a society that treats women like property that can be bought and sold needs to be torn apart and rebuilt on better foundations." The silence that followed Jack's words was profound. Even Harold seemed momentarily stunned by the radical nature of the statement. In 1887 Texas, suggesting that women deserved equal rights was not just controversial, it was revolutionary. Dr. Wright chose that moment to make his own stand. "I've taken an oath to do no harm," he announced. "I cannot and will not provide medical treatment for injuries caused by this punishment. If you proceed with this whipping, Harold, you do so knowing that I will not help repair the damage you cause." Harold's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. "Fine," he snarled. "We'll see how defiant the girl remains after she's felt the bite of leather." He raised the strap again, but this time Jack was ready for him. The rancher bounded up the remaining steps and grabbed Harold's wrist before he could bring the weapon down on Margaret's back.